"Sir, if you don't leave that seat right now, airport security will remove you from this aircraft." In front of everyone, Lauren Brooks delivered the words without blinking, her voice cutting clean across the silent first-class cabin. Every passenger in the row went still. Marcus Hayes, 30 years old, dressed in a plain shirt and worn jeans, did not flinch. He reached down and placed his boarding pass face up on the tray table, where she could not ignore it. He did not raise his voice. He did not move. 8 minutes later, a series of urgent calls flooded the cockpit, and every member of that crew went pale. Marcus Hayes had learned a long time ago that the way a man carried himself in a room said more than anything he could put on paper. He was 30 years old, and he had stopped caring what a room thought of him somewhere around the time he realized that the people who judged fastest were usually the ones who understood least. He wore what he wore because it was clean and it fit: dark jeans, a gray Henley, white sneakers that were spotless but carried no label anyone in first class would recognize. His carry-on was a canvas duffel that had seen 4 years of airport floors, and his laptop bag was older than most of the flight attendants working Sterling Air's morning routes. He looked like a man who fixed things for a living, and in a way, he did. The gate for Sterling Air Flight 417 to New York was already crowded when Marcus arrived with his daughter on his hip. Zoe was 7 years old, small for her age, with 2 braids that her father had done himself that morning, using a tutorial he had watched 11 times before he got the parts even. She had a backpack shaped like a ladybug and a coloring book tucked under one arm, and she was asking him the same question she had been asking every 15 minutes since they left the house. "Daddy, when are we getting to New York?" Marcus shifted her weight to his other arm and smiled. "Long enough for you to finish that butterfly you started." She considered this and nodded, satisfied with the timeline. His seat was confirmed. 2A, the window position in the first row of the first-class cabin. He had booked it 3 weeks earlier for a meeting that could not be rescheduled with people who did not wait. He found his seat without help, stowed his bag in the overhead compartment, and settled Zoe into 2B beside him. He buckled her seatbelt, pulled the coloring book from her backpack, and set it on her tray table with a small pack of crayons. She picked up a purple crayon and began filling in the wings of a butterfly that took up most of the page. Her feet did not reach the floor. Her tongue poked out slightly when she concentrated, the same way his did when he was deep inside a spreadsheet, though he would never admit to the resemblance. The cabin was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that only lasts until the rest of the passengers start boarding, and for a moment it was just the 2 of them in a row that smelled like leather and recycled air, and everything was fine. Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up a document he had been reviewing for the better part of a week. The numbers on the screen represented a partnership agreement between his company, Hayes Capital Group, and Sterling Air, the same airline whose seat he was currently occupying. The deal was worth $40 million at its current valuation, and it was scheduled to be finalized at the meeting in New York that afternoon. The people on the other side of that table had never met him in person. They had seen his name on documents, heard his voice on calls, reviewed his projections and his terms, but none of them knew his face, his age, or what he looked like. He was not thinking about the seat or the flight. He was thinking about whether the terms they had negotiated were going to hold. None of them would have guessed that the man behind the projections was a 30-year-old single father who had built his company from a 1-bedroom apartment while his daughter slept in the next room. Zoe hummed softly beside him, coloring inside the lines with the careful precision of a child who took butterflies seriously. Lauren Brooks noticed Marcus the moment she walked the cabin for her pre-boarding check. She was the senior flight attendant on this route, sharp-eyed and precise in the way that came from years of learning which passengers needed managing before they became problems. She had a way of reading a cabin that had nothing to do with names on a manifest and everything to do with appearances. A black man in jeans with a canvas duffel sitting in 2A, with a small child beside him, read to her as an error. Either a mistake in the booking system or someone who had gotten lucky on an upgrade and did not quite know how to wear it yet. She made a mental note and moved on, but the note stayed with her. Ryan Cooper, the first-class cabin supervisor, was running through the pre-departure checklist at the forward galley when Lauren passed him her assessment with a single glance. Ryan looked toward 2A, took in the same picture, and went back to his checklist with his mouth set in a thin line. Neither of them said anything yet. They did not need to. Evelyn Carter came through the jet bridge at 9:22. She was in her mid-50s, dressed in a charcoal blazer and tailored ivory trousers that announced themselves before she spoke. She was the kind of woman who treated first-class cabins the way other people treated their living rooms, as a space that belonged to her by some unspoken agreement with the universe. She had flown Sterling's New York route at least twice a month for the past 4 years, and in that time, she had accumulated enough loyalty points and enough goodwill with the regular crew that certain things had become informal expectations. One of those things was the window seat in the first row. Her confirmed seat was 4C in the business class section, but Evelyn Carter had not sat in business class in 3 years, and she did not intend to start today. She walked past the business class rows without slowing, nodded to Lauren at the cabin door, and moved directly toward row 2. The gate agent had not stopped her. Lauren had seen her walk past business class and said nothing. This was, in the small and unexamined way that systems fail, how it began. Evelyn stopped at the entrance to the first-class section. Her eyes went straight to row 2. The man in the window seat had a laptop open, and a child beside him coloring quietly. Her gaze moved from Marcus to Zoe and back again, and something settled in her face that was not confusion, but certainty. The wrong kind. She turned to Lauren with the look of a person who expected someone else to solve a problem immediately. Lauren moved toward the row and addressed Marcus in a low voice. "Sir, I think there may be some confusion about your seat assignment. Could I take a look at your boarding pass?" Marcus handed it over without comment. She looked at it. The confirmation was clear. Seat 2A, first class, booked, and paid in full, under the name Marcus Hayes. She looked at it for a moment longer than was necessary, then handed it back. "I'll need to verify this against our system. There may have been a duplicate assignment." Marcus took the boarding pass back. "There wasn't," he said. "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago. The confirmation number is on the pass if you need it." Lauren did not respond directly. She turned and went back to the galley. And from the aisle behind her, Evelyn Carter's voice carried across the cabin with the particular volume of someone who wanted to be heard. "This is ridiculous. People like him don't just end up in first class. Someone clearly made a mistake." The words hung in the air. People like him. Every passenger in the forward cabin heard it. No one said anything, but 2 passengers in the rows behind had already begun recording, their phones angled low, screens tilted downward, faces neutral. Marcus heard every word. He did not turn around. He did not react. He set his boarding pass back on the tray table where it remained visible and looked at Zoe. She had stopped coloring and was looking up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. "Daddy, why is that lady angry?" "She's not angry at us, baby. She's just having a bad day. Keep coloring." Zoe picked up the purple crayon again, but her hand moved slower now, and the line she drew drifted outside the wing for the first time. Ryan Cooper walked to the row and introduced himself with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Ryan Cooper, the cabin supervisor. I apologize for any inconvenience. We have a situation where a long-standing premium passenger has the same seat assignment, and we'd like to offer you an alternative seat in first class. Same service, same amenities, while we sort out the discrepancy in our system." Marcus looked at Ryan the way a man looks at a sentence that does not add up. "There's no discrepancy," he said. "My ticket is valid. If there's a duplicate, the system will show when each booking was made, and mine will be earlier. I'm not moving." Ryan's smile tightened. He was not accustomed to that answer in this cabin. Most passengers, when offered an alternative with enough warmth and professional language, accepted it as a reasonable compromise. Marcus was not most passengers, and the offer had not landed as a compromise. It had landed as what it was, which was a request to give up something he had already paid for, so that a white woman who had walked past her own assigned section could have it instead. He had been in enough rooms to know when a suggestion was not a suggestion, and he had decided a long time ago that the cost of standing still was always lower than the cost of giving ground to someone who had no right to ask for it. Evelyn stepped forward and addressed Ryan directly, as though Marcus were not present. "I've been flying this route for 4 years," she said. "I shouldn't have to stand here arguing with someone who clearly doesn't belong in this section." Doesn't belong. The second time she had used that language. The cabin heard it again. The man in row 4 adjusted his phone angle slightly. Marcus turned and looked at Evelyn directly for the first time. His expression did not change. "I have a boarding pass, a confirmation number, and a paid seat assignment," he said. "If you have the same, then we have a system error, and the airline needs to resolve it. If you don't, then you don't have a claim." He turned back to face the front, without waiting for a response. Evelyn's face shifted in a way that made it clear she was not accustomed to being answered like that, least of all by a man who looked the way Marcus looked in a space she had decided he did not belong. She looked to Lauren, then to Ryan, with an expression that was both an accusation and a demand. The silence she held was louder than anything she might have said next. Ryan and Lauren exchanged a glance. The decision was made, without words. Lauren picked up the internal phone in the forward galley and made a call to the cockpit. The cabin was filling now, and the situation at the front had started to draw the kind of attention that people on planes quietly observe while pretending not to notice. A woman across the aisle had lowered her magazine. The man in row 3 had turned his head fully and was watching with undisguised interest. Whatever was coming next, they had decided it was not their problem to solve anymore. It was going to come from above. Captain Samuel Harris was a man who had spent 23 years in the air and had learned to trust his crew the way he trusted his instruments, without second-guessing, without delay. He was methodical, experienced, and deeply committed to running a clean operation. What he was not, on this particular morning, was someone who had time to stand in the first-class cabin and arbitrate a seating dispute 40 minutes before departure. When Lauren's call came through, he listened to her version of the situation, asked 2 questions, and made his decision before he had all the facts. That was the mistake. It did not look like a mistake at the time. It rarely does. He came through the forward galley door with the particular bearing of a man whose uniform still commanded a room, even when he was not trying. The first-class cabin went quieter when he appeared. Ryan stepped aside. Lauren positioned herself near the galley entrance. Evelyn, who had taken a temporary seat in 3A, straightened when she saw him. Harris stopped at row 2 and looked at Marcus. He saw a young black man in casual clothes sitting next to a small child with crayons on her tray table. He did not see a boarding pass. He did not check the manifest. He did not ask the system to verify the booking. He saw what the rest of his crew had seen, and he drew the same conclusion they had drawn, and he did not stop to question whether that conclusion had anything to do with the facts or everything to do with what Marcus looked like sitting in that particular seat. "Mr. Hayes," he said, keeping his voice even. "I'm Captain Harris. I've been briefed on the situation, and I want to resolve this before we push back. I'm going to ask you one more time to move to an alternate seat while our ground team verifies the booking details." Marcus looked up from his laptop. "Captain," he said, "I've shown my boarding pass to 2 members of your crew. The seat assignment is valid. The confirmation number is on the pass. I've asked them to run it against the manifest, and they haven't done that in front of me. I'm not going to move from a seat I paid for because it's more convenient for the airline to ask me to wait somewhere else." Harris kept his expression steady. "I understand your position, but I have a responsibility to the safety and comfort of everyone on this aircraft. And right now this situation is creating a disruption. I need you to cooperate." Marcus closed his laptop fully. "Verifying a seat assignment takes less than 2 minutes, he said. "If you pull up the manifest right now, you will see my name on seat 2A with a booking date 3 weeks ago. That's not a disruption. That's a resolution. The disruption is that your crew is choosing not to do that." He was not raising his voice. He delivered every sentence the way a man delivers facts, without decoration, without apology. Harris looked at him for a long moment. A man sitting quietly in a seat and declining to move was not a safety issue, but he had already committed to a course of action in front of his crew, and reversing it now felt like a different kind of problem. He made the wrong call for the right-sounding reason. "Mr. Hayes, I'm the commanding officer of this aircraft, and I'm formally requesting that you move. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to involve airport security. Marcus looked at him. Then involve them, he said, because I'm not leaving this seat. Airport security arrived within 4 minutes. 2 officers in blue uniforms came through the jet bridge with the practiced neutrality of people who had been called into dozens of situations exactly like this one. They listened to Lauren's summary at the galley entrance, nodded, and walked to row 2. The taller of the 2 officers addressed Marcus directly. Sir, the airline has requested that you deplane. We're going to need you to come with us. Marcus gathered his things without argument. He closed his laptop, zipped his bag, and stood up from seat 2A with the boarding pass still in his hand. He did not make a scene. He did not raise his voice or appeal to the other passengers, or say anything dramatic as he moved toward the front of the cabin. But before he stepped into the aisle, he knelt down beside Zoe. The little girl looked up at her father with eyes that held a question no 7-year-old should have to ask. She did not understand why the people in uniforms were making her daddy leave. She did not understand what they had done wrong, or why the woman in the aisle had spoken about them the way she had. She only understood that something was happening that felt unfair, and that her father was the calmest person in the room, and that somehow that was not enough. We didn't do anything wrong, baby, Marcus said quietly, his voice steady and warm in a way that cost him more than anyone watching would ever know. Sometimes people make mistakes. We're going to be okay. He lifted Zoe into his arms, picked up her ladybug backpack and the coloring book with a half-finished butterfly, and walked out of that aircraft the same way he had walked in, without performance, without urgency, with the quiet self-possession of a man who had already decided how this was going to end and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Evelyn Carter moved into seat 2A before the jet bridge door had finished closing behind him. The cabin settled. Lauren and Ryan exchanged a look that said the problem had been handled. Harris returned to the cockpit. The boarding process resumed as though the previous 30 minutes had been a minor administrative delay, rather than a black father, and his daughter being removed from seats they had legally purchased, because a white woman with a first-class ticket had decided they did not belong. The remaining passengers went back to their phones and their headphones, and the particular self-contained silence of people who had witnessed something uncomfortable and chosen not to examine it too closely. No one had stood up. No one had said, "That man has a valid ticket." No one had asked the crew to check the manifest before removing a passenger in front of his child. The cabin had watched, and the cabin had been quiet, and that silence would sit differently with some of them later, when the video made it clear just how wrong the situation had been. Except for the ones who had been recording. David Mercer was a software consultant from Chicago who had been flying first class on Sterling Air for the past 6 years. He was sitting in row 4 in a gray jacket, and he had recorded every moment from the first time Evelyn Carter opened her mouth. The video was 2 minutes and 11 seconds long. It showed Lauren telling Marcus to move, Ryan's offer of an alternative seat, Marcus's calm refusal, Evelyn's words captured in full audio, Harris's arrival and formal warning, and finally, Marcus kneeling beside his daughter, lifting her into his arms, and walking off the aircraft with his boarding pass still in his hand. It did not show anything that needed to be explained or contextualized. It was exactly what it looked like. The video went up at 9:47 in the morning, 2 minutes after the scheduled departure time. Mercer posted it with a single line of text that read, "Watched a black man with a valid first-class ticket get removed from his seat so a white woman without one could take it. His 7-year-old daughter was with him. Flight 417 out of Chicago. Draw your own conclusions." By 10:15, the video had been shared 11,000 times. By 10:40, it had crossed 100,000. The hashtag that attached itself to the clip was not flattering. It was also not inaccurate. Sterling Air racism was trending on every major platform before the aircraft had even reached cruising altitude. Back inside the terminal, Marcus Hayes was standing at the Sterling Air customer service desk with his boarding pass on the counter, and Zoe sitting in a plastic chair beside him, her feet swinging above the floor and her coloring book open on her lap. He had already made 2 calls. The first was to his assistant in New York, who was rearranging the afternoon schedule and sending apologies to 3 people who did not yet know why the meeting would start late. The second was to a direct line he did not often use, belonging to a man named Gerald Finch, who was Sterling Air's senior vice president of corporate partnerships. Marcus had met Gerald 8 months earlier, at the beginning of a negotiation that had been ongoing ever since, a partnership agreement between Hayes Capital Group and Sterling Air, worth somewhere in the range of $40 million. The contract was scheduled to be finalized at the New York meeting that afternoon. Gerald Finch picked up on the second ring. Marcus gave him a straightforward account of what had happened. He did not editorialize. He did not raise his voice, or use any word that carried more heat than the situation itself already contained. He told Gerald the flight number, the seat assignment, the names of the crew members involved, as he had observed them, the words that had been used in the cabin. People like him doesn't belong, and the fact that he was currently standing in Terminal C with his 7-year-old daughter, having been walked off the aircraft by airport security for declining to give up a seat he had paid for. He said it the way he said everything, without drama, without heat, which somehow made it worse to hear. Gerald said very little during the call. When Marcus finished, Gerald said, "I'll call you back in 10 minutes. The call ended. There was something in Gerald's voice that Marcus recognized, the particular restraint of a man who was choosing not to say what he was actually thinking because what he was actually thinking involved language that would not help anyone. Marcus had heard that tone before, in boardrooms and conference calls, when someone on the other end of the line had just realized that a situation they thought was manageable had become something else entirely. Gerald was not angry at Marcus. Gerald was angry at his own airline, and he was trying to figure out how to say that without saying it. Zoe looked up from her coloring book. "Daddy, are we still going to New York?" Marcus sat down in the chair beside her and put his arm around her small shoulders. "Yes, baby, we're still going." She leaned into him and went back to her butterfly. Marcus watched her color for a moment, the purple crayon moving carefully along the wing's edge, and something in his chest tightened in the way it only did when the world reminded him of what it meant to raise a black child in a country that still had not decided whether she belonged in certain rooms. What happened in the next 10 minutes was not visible from the terminal floor, but it moved fast. Gerald Finch went first to Sterling Air's chief operating officer, whose name was Patricia Holloway, and whose office was on the 14th floor of the Sterling Air headquarters building on the west side of Chicago. Patricia had already been forwarded the video by her communications director, who had flagged it at 10:22 as a potential crisis-level exposure event. The video had been viewed 40,000 times in the first 35 minutes. The communications director had used the phrase reputational emergency in her message, and she had not been exaggerating. When Gerald Finch called and identified the man in the video as Marcus Hayes, CEO of Hayes Capital Group, the principal stakeholder in the airline's largest pending corporate deal, Patricia Holloway's response was immediate and unambiguous. She pulled up the booking manifest for Flight 417 herself. Seat 2A. Marcus Hayes, booked 22 days ago, paid in full. No flags, no errors, no duplicate assignment. She stared at the screen for 3 seconds, and then she pulled up Evelyn Carter's profile. Evelyn had a confirmed seat in business class, 4C, not first class, not 2A. She had not been assigned seat 2A at any point in the booking history. She had walked past her assigned section, entered a cabin she had no ticket for, and leveraged her frequent flyer status, her skin color, and her tone of voice to have the airline remove the rightful passenger and his child on her behalf. No one at the gate or at the cabin door had stopped her, because no one had checked. The system had not failed. The people in it had. Patricia Holloway did not send an email. She picked up the phone and called the gate directly. The aircraft was still at the gate, departure delayed, while the crew completed a paperwork correction related to the boarding sequence. The gate agent transferred the call to the aircraft's internal line. Lauren Brooks answered. What Patricia said on that call was brief and specific. Lauren's expression, visible to Ryan from across the galley, changed in a way that made him set down what he was holding and give her his full attention. When Lauren hung up, she turned to Ryan, and for the first time that morning, neither of them had anything to say. The call to Captain Harris came separately, directly from the operations center. It was not a suggestion. It was not a conversation. It was a notification delivered in language that left no room for interpretation or appeal. The suspension notices were delivered digitally, time-stamped at 10:51 in the morning, before the aircraft had pushed back from the gate. Lauren Brooks, Ryan Cooper, and Captain Samuel Harris each received formal notification of immediate administrative suspension pending investigation, with language that made the likely outcome clear to anyone who had read one of these documents before. The grounds cited were failure to verify passenger documentation, removal of a ticketed passenger without cause, conduct inconsistent with Sterling Air's equal treatment policy, and specific violation of the airline's anti-discrimination and racial bias protocols. 3 careers, built over a combined total of more than 40 years, had been placed in jeopardy by a decision that took less than 30 minutes to make and less than 30 seconds to regret. Evelyn Carter was asked to deplane. A gate agent collected her carry-on from the overhead compartment of seat 2A and walked her back through the jet bridge without ceremony. She did not go quietly, but the terminal was a public place, and by that hour, there were people who recognized her from the video that was still spreading across every platform. She said nothing that improved her situation. Gerald Finch called Marcus back at exactly the 10-minute mark, as promised. "We need you back at that gate," Gerald said. "The airline is sending someone to you right now." "I'm sorry this happened, Marcus. I am genuinely sorry." Marcus did not say that it was fine, because it was not fine. He said, "I know," and left it at that. He stood up from the plastic chair, picked up his bag from the counter, and looked down at Zoe, who was still coloring, undisturbed by the adults and their problems. She slid off her chair, reached up, and took his hand the way she always did, with her whole fist wrapped around 2 of his fingers. Marcus picked up her backpack with his free hand, tucked the boarding pass into his shirt pocket, and walked back through Terminal C toward the gate with his daughter beside him. Around them, the airport moved the way airports always move. Indifferent and continuous, 1,000 small departures happening all at once. Marcus did not look like a man who had just changed the trajectory of 3 careers and the reputation of a major airline. He looked like a father walking his daughter to a gate, holding her hand, carrying her ladybug backpack, and he had been made to wait longer than he should have. No one in the terminal looked at him twice. No one recognized his face from the video that was still climbing its way across the country. He was just a man with a duffel bag and a small girl who needed to catch a flight, and the world around him had no idea what had just happened or what was about to happen next. The gate door was still open. The aircraft departed Chicago at 11:22 in the morning, 37 minutes behind schedule. Marcus Hayes was in seat 2A. Zoe was in 2B. The butterfly finished, a rabbit now taking shape on the next page. The cabin around them was quieter than it had been before, the particular quiet of a space where something significant had happened, and the people remaining in it were still processing what they had witnessed. A few passengers glanced at Marcus when he settled back in, then looked away and returned to their screens. Marcus did not open his laptop immediately. He sat for a moment with his bag stowed and his hands resting on the armrests, looking out the window at the tarmac moving slowly beneath the aircraft. Zoe leaned against his arm, her crayon still in her hand, and he let the last 2 hours settle into something he could carry without it weighing more than it needed to. He did not feel triumphant. That was the part that people who had not been through something like this always got wrong. The assumption that being proven right felt like winning. What it actually felt like was tired, and beneath the tiredness, something older and heavier. The particular exhaustion of being a black man in America who had spent the better part of 2 hours proving that he had the right to sit in a seat he had paid for in front of his daughter, while strangers decided based on the color of his skin that he did not belong. When the aircraft leveled out above the cloud line, he finally opened his laptop and returned to the document he had been reviewing when all of this started. He got to New York. The meeting happened, the terms held, while Marcus was in the air. Sterling Air was burning on the ground. By noon, the video posted by David Mercer had crossed 400,000 views and was being picked up by news aggregators on both coasts. By 1 in the afternoon, 2 national outlets had run digital pieces under headlines that did not require much editorial creativity. A black father with a valid first-class ticket had been escorted off a plane with his 7-year-old daughter by airport security so that a white woman who did not have a first-class ticket could take his seat, and the airline's own crew had facilitated it without verifying a single document. The facts were not in dispute. The manifest said what it said. The video showed what it showed, and Evelyn Carter's words, captured in full audio, said exactly what the country heard them say. The conversation that followed was not about whether the airline had done something wrong. It was about what it meant that they had done it so easily. Lauren Brooks received her suspension notice at 10:51 and spent the rest of that day in a state of controlled disbelief that gradually curdled into dread. She had worked for Sterling Air for 9 years. She had received commendations. She had never had a formal complaint that had not been resolved in her favor. She sat in her apartment that afternoon, with her phone face down on the table, and tried to construct a version of the morning in which she had done the reasonable thing. The problem was that the video existed. She had watched it twice before she made herself stop. She could see herself in the frame, standing beside seat 2A with her chin slightly raised, addressing a man who was holding valid documentation and asking him to move as though the documentation were incidental. She had not checked the manifest. She had not compared booking timestamps. She had looked at a black man with a canvas bag and a child, and she had looked at Evelyn Carter standing in the aisle, and she had made a decision about which passenger's comfort mattered more. She had decided who Marcus was before she had verified anything. That was the beginning, and it was also, she was starting to understand, the end. Captain Samuel Harris did not call anyone. He sat in his car in the airport parking structure for 40 minutes after the aircraft returned later that evening, with the engine off and his hands resting on the steering wheel. He was not a man who made excuses for himself easily. He had prided himself on being the last line of accountability on any aircraft he commanded. Today, he had been the final authority who ratified someone else's mistake and made it official. He had looked at Marcus Hayes and seen what his crew had seen, not a man with a valid ticket, but a man who did not look like he belonged. That failure was not procedural. It was personal, and he knew, sitting in that parking structure with the engine cooling and the lot emptying around him, that it was not the kind of failure a career recovered from. Evelyn Carter did not issue a statement that day or the next. Her publicist released a brief note 3 days later, acknowledging that the situation had been deeply regrettable. The note did not include an apology to Marcus Hayes or his daughter. The absence was noted widely and commented on at length. Marcus Hayes met with Patricia Holloway and Gerald Finch 2 days after the incident in a conference room at Sterling Air's headquarters. He came alone, with no legal representation and no prepared demands. "Du was at school." He sat down across from both of them and said what he had come to say in plain language, without preamble. He did not want a financial settlement. He was not interested in litigation. What he wanted was specific and structural. A public apology directed at him by name, issued by the airline's CEO, rather than the communications department. A full review and retraining of Sterling Air's passenger verification procedures, with mandatory implicit racial bias training for all crew members so that no employee would ever again be in a position to remove a passenger without running a documented check against the manifest first. A formal policy, written and published, establishing that seat assignments were to be honored on the basis of documentation alone, regardless of a passenger's appearance, race, or frequency of travel. And an end to any informal practice of allowing loyalty program status to override the documented rights of other ticketed passengers. Patricia Holloway listened to everything without interrupting. When Marcus finished, she told him that Sterling Air agreed to all 4 points. Gerald Finch, sitting to her left, said nothing during the meeting, but when it ended, and the 3 of them stood, he shook Marcus's hand and held it a moment longer than necessary. The public apology from Sterling Air's CEO went out the following morning. It named Marcus Hayes. It used the word wrong without qualification and did not reach for regrettable or unfortunate. It said the airline had been wrong, that a passenger and his daughter had been treated unjustly on the basis of race, and that the people responsible had faced consequences consistent with the severity of what had occurred. The partnership agreement between Hayes Capital Group and Sterling Air was finalized the following week in New York. The terms were identical to what they had been before any of this happened. Marcus had never made the deal contingent on the outcome of the incident. That was not how he operated. David Mercer received a direct message from Marcus 2 weeks later. It was brief. It thanked him for what he had done and for doing it without being asked. Mercer replied that he had not expected the video to travel as far as it did, that he had posted it because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be seen, and that he was glad it had mattered. Marcus read the reply on a Tuesday morning, sitting at a desk in an unremarkable office in Chicago with a coffee going cold to his left. Zoe was at school. He put the phone down and went back to work. He was, at 30, a man who had learned that the world does not often reward stillness. People mistake it for passivity, for weakness, for an invitation. What it actually is, when it belongs to the right person, is a form of precision, knowing exactly how much force a situation requires, and applying nothing more and nothing less. He had not raised his voice in that cabin. He had simply stayed where he was, with the facts in front of him and his daughter beside him, and waited for the truth to do what it eventually always does when you give it enough room.